Welcome to Revenge Central. I hope you're doing well. Today I will read 5 crazy revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, and let's get started with Story 1. My neighbor spiked my crops with herbicide. I got my farm back and then some. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a vengeful person. I am a farmer. 3rd generation. My grandfather cleared this land with his own hands in 1952, pulling stumps and rocks out of soil so rich it would make you weep. My father worked it through droughts, floods, and the farm crisis of the 80s that broke so many families around us. I inherited this land in 2019 when my father passed. I stood at his funeral and made a promise to him, standing right there beside the casket, with tractors idling in the distance, like mourners themselves. I promised him I would never sell, not 1 acre, not to anyone, not for any price. I had no idea then that keeping that promise would nearly destroy me. I had no idea that the man living on the adjacent property, a man I'd known since childhood, a man who came to my father's funeral and shook my hand with tears in his eyes, was already plotting to take everything I had. His name is Richard Calloway, and what he did to me, and to at least 11 other farming families in our county, is a story so twisted, so calculated, so breathtakingly evil, that I still have trouble believing it happened. Even now, even with the court documents sitting in a folder on my kitchen table, even with the settlement check framed on my wall. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where every good nightmare starts, at the beginning. My farm is 340 acres in Henderson County, Kentucky. Rolling hills, bottomland near a creek, and some of the most productive soil in the western part of the state. We grow corn, soybeans, and about 40 acres of specialty produce, heirloom tomatoes, bell peppers, squash, and green beans that we sell at farmers markets and to local restaurants. The specialty produce is where the real money is. A single acre of heirloom tomatoes, managed right, can generate $15,000 to $20,000 in a season. My 40 acres of produce brought in roughly $420,000 in gross revenue in 2021. That was my best year ever. I was 34 years old, debt-free, and I felt like the king of the world. Richard Calloway's property bordered mine on the east side. His family had owned a modest 80-acre farm there for decades. Richard had inherited it too, but unlike me, he had no interest in farming. He'd made his money in real estate development in Nashville, and he'd been buying up parcels around our county for years, little by little, parcel by parcel. I didn't think much of it at first. People buy and sell land all the time in farming communities. But looking back, I should have seen the pattern. Every property Richard bought bordered someone else's farm. Every purchase brought him closer to assembling a contiguous tract large enough for the kind of development he really wanted. A 600-acre mixed-use commercial and residential project he'd been pitching to the County Planning Commission since 2018. There was just one problem. My farm sat dead center in the middle of his proposed development footprint, and I had made a promise. The first sign that something was wrong came in late June of 2022. I was walking my tomato fields early in the morning, doing what I do every day during growing season, checking for pests, inspecting fruit set, making sure the drip irrigation was running properly. I like to walk the rows before the sun gets too high. There's a piece to it that I can't find anywhere else in the world. That morning, something was off. A section of my Roma tomatoes, maybe a 1/4 acre, looked sick. The leaves were curling inward, turning a mottled yellow-brown. The new growth was twisted, deformed, like something had grabbed the plant by the stem and wrung it out. I knelt down and touched the leaves. They were papery and brittle. My heart started beating faster. Not from exertion, from fear. I've been farming my whole life. I know what disease looks like. I know what pest damage looks like. I know what nutrient deficiency looks like. This wasn't any of those things. The pattern was too uniform, too sudden, too concentrated in one area. It looked like chemical damage. But I hadn't sprayed anything. My herbicide applications for the season were done in April, well before any of these plants were in the ground. I walked the entire section, row by row, and the damage was contained to a roughly circular area about 100 feet across, right in the middle of my healthiest, most productive tomato block. I called my county extension agent, a woman named Darlene Moss, who'd been helping farmers in Henderson County for 25 years. She came out the next morning with her testing kit and a look of professional concern that did absolutely nothing to calm my nerves. "Herbicide drift," she said, kneeling beside a devastated tomato plant and turning a curled leaf over in her fingers. "This is definitely 2,4-D or something in the dicamba family. The epinastic response, that's the downward curling, and the leaf cupping are textbook symptoms." "But I haven't sprayed anything," I said. "Nobody around here sprays this time of year on tomatoes." Darlene looked at me with those knowing eyes of hers. "That's what makes it drift. Somebody sprayed something they shouldn't have, or they sprayed at the wrong time, and the wind carried it onto your property." I filed a complaint with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. They sent an investigator out 2 weeks later. By that time, the damage had spread. Another half-acre of tomatoes was showing symptoms, and I'd found similar damage in my pepper rows about 200 yards to the north. The state investigator took soil samples and plant tissue samples. He looked around the neighboring properties. He asked me if I knew of anyone in the area who might be using dicamba or 2,4-D improperly. I told him I didn't. That was true at the time. The investigator's report came back a month later. Inconclusive. They'd detected trace amounts of a dicamba formulation in the soil samples, but the levels were too low to definitively identify the source. The wind patterns at the time of the suspected application didn't clearly point to any specific neighboring property. "Case closed," they said. "File an insurance claim if you have crop insurance." I did have crop insurance. But crop insurance doesn't cover everything, and it certainly doesn't cover the kind of specialty produce losses I was looking at. My adjuster, a pleasant enough man named Phil, explained it to me with the kind of gentle bluntness that insurance adjusters specialize in. "Your policy covers yield loss on your commodity crops," he said, gesturing at my corn and soybean fields. "But the specialty produce, the tomatoes, the peppers, that's a different classification. You'd need a separate rider for that. And looking at your policy, you don't have one." I lost $60,000 worth of produce that summer. $60,000, gone. Just like that. Wilted and brown and dead in the field while I stood there and watched it happen, and couldn't do a single thing about it. I told myself it was bad luck. Herbicide drift happens. It's an unfortunate reality of modern agriculture. I absorbed the loss, tightened my belt, and prepared for the fall harvest. I should have been more suspicious. God knows I should have been. But I trusted the people around me. I trusted the land. I trusted that bad things happen once in a while and then they stop. They didn't stop. The following spring, 2023, I replanted the affected areas and expanded my tomato acreage by 5 acres to make up for the previous year's losses. I was determined to recover. I put in longer hours, invested in better row covers, and upgraded my irrigation system with moisture sensors that would alert me to any stress in the plants. Everything was beautiful through May and the first half of June. The tomatoes were growing like nothing I'd ever seen. Deep green foliage, strong stems, blossoms everywhere. I remember standing at the edge of the field one evening, the sun setting behind me, painting the whole valley gold, and thinking to myself that this was going to be the year that put me over the top. The year I could finally start thinking about expanding, maybe buying that adjacent 50-acre parcel old Mrs. Patterson's kids were trying to sell. Then I woke up on July 3rd, and my world collapsed again. It was worse this time, much worse. Instead of a 1/4 acre, I found 3 full acres of tomatoes showing the same curling, mottling, and deformity. My bell peppers were hit too, almost 2 acres of them, and my green beans, my beautiful, healthy green beans, 2 solid acres of them, were yellowed and stunted, the leaves cupped upward like little sad umbrellas. I sank to my knees right there in the dirt. "I'm not ashamed to admit it," I cried. I put my hands in the soil that my grandfather had cleared and my father had worked, and I had bled over, and I wept like a child. Because this wasn't drift. Drift doesn't work like this. Drift doesn't hit multiple non-contiguous sections of your farm in a pattern that suggests deliberate, targeted application. Drift doesn't somehow avoid your neighbor's fields while devastating yours with surgical precision. Somebody was doing this to me on purpose. The thought landed like a punch to the stomach. I sat there in the dirt for a long time, thinking about who would want to hurt me like this. Who would want to destroy my livelihood, my family's legacy, my entire reason for getting out of bed every morning? A name floated up from the depths of my memory, and I pushed it back down. Not yet. I wasn't ready to go there. Instead, I called Darlene again. She came out that same afternoon, and when she saw the extent of the damage, her face went pale beneath her sun hat. "This isn't drift," she said, echoing my own thoughts. "This is directed application. Somebody is spraying your crops deliberately." "Can you prove that?" I asked. "With the right evidence, yes. But I need to be honest with you. The state ag department wasn't much help last time. You need to build your own case." She gave me the name of a private agricultural consultant named Walt Briggs, a retired USDA investigator who now did expert witness work and crop damage assessment. She said he was expensive but worth every penny. She said he was the best in the state at what he did, and if anyone could figure out what was happening to my farm, it was Walt. I called Walt that evening. He answered on the second ring with a voice like gravel and a no-nonsense attitude that I found immediately comforting. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." I talked for 45 minutes. When I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "How much land do you have?" Walt asked. 340 acres. "And who are your nearest neighbors?" I told him. I listed them all. The Hendersons to the south, the Nguyens to the west, old Mr. Kowalski to the north, and Richard Calloway to the east. "How long has Calloway been trying to buy your place?" Walt asked. I nearly dropped the phone. "How did you know about that?" "Because I've seen this pattern before," Walt said. "More times than you'd think. A developer wants land, the farmer won't sell, and suddenly, the farmer's crops start dying. It's not common, but it happens. And when it does, it's almost always the same playbook." He told me to install trail cameras immediately, multiple cameras, positioned to cover the perimeter of my most valuable fields. He told me to get cameras with infrared capability for nighttime recording. He told me to look up, not just at ground level. "Look up?" I asked. "If someone is spraying your crops with herbicide, they're not doing it on foot. They're using a drone. Probably a large agricultural drone with a spraying rig. You need cameras that can capture the sky above your fields." A drone. Of course. A drone. That explained everything. The precision of the application, the nighttime timing, the way the damage appeared in specific areas, without any evidence of ground traffic. A drone could fly over my property in the dead of night, spray herbicide in a precise pattern, and be gone before anyone woke up. I went out the next day and bought 6 trail cameras. Bushnell trophy cams, the kind hunters use. Good infrared range, decent resolution, long battery life. I also bought 2 cellular security cameras from a company called Reolink, the kind that send real-time alerts to your phone and store footage in the cloud so even if someone finds and destroys the camera, the footage is safe. Walt came out 2 days later and helped me position everything. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with a weathered face and the calm, methodical demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years investigating agricultural crimes. "You want overlapping fields of view," he explained, mounting a camera on a T-post at the corner of my tomato field. "No blind spots. If something flies over this field at night, I want at least 3 cameras picking it up." 3 cameras for one section? That's how you build an airtight case. One camera can be challenged. 3 cameras showing the same event from different angles? That's very hard to argue with. We spent 2 full days setting up the camera system. Walt also recommended I install a small weather station to record wind speed and direction at the time of any incident, and a noise-activated audio recorder that might pick up the distinctive whine of a drone's propellers. "You're going to catch this person," Walt told me as he loaded his truck to leave. "But you need to be patient, and you need to be smart. Don't confront anyone. Don't tell anyone what you're doing. Let the cameras do the work." I promised him I would. I went to bed that night with a mixture of anxiety and hope churning in my stomach. For the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something instead of just taking hit after hit. What I didn't know was that I was about to uncover something far bigger than my own personal nightmare. Richard Calloway made his move 3 weeks after I installed the cameras, July 24, 2023, a Monday. I remember the date because it was the day before my mother's birthday, and I'd been planning to drive down to Paducah to visit her. I was up at 4:30 a.m., as usual, doing my morning walkthrough before the heat set in. Everything looked fine. The tomatoes were lush and green, the peppers were setting fruit beautifully, and my soybean fields were a carpet of healthy foliage. I went back to the house, made coffee, checked my phone. One notification from the Reolink app. Motion detected on camera 3, East Tomato Block, at 2:47 a.m. I opened the app and pulled up the footage. My hands started shaking. There it was, clear as day, even in infrared. A drone, a large drone, maybe 4 feet across, flying low over my tomato field at roughly 2:47 in the morning. The infrared footage showed it as a dark silhouette against the slightly warmer background of the field, and you could clearly see a fine mist coming from underneath it. A spraying system. The drone made 3 passes over my tomatoes, each pass taking about 40 seconds before climbing sharply and disappearing to the east. To the east, toward Richard Calloway's property. I checked the other cameras. Camera 1, positioned at the north end of the same field, had captured the drone approaching from the east. Camera 5, at the south end, had captured it leaving. The timestamps matched perfectly. The audio recorder had picked up a high-pitched whining sound consistent with multi-rotor drone propellers. I sat at my kitchen table and watched that footage 17 times. Each time, the rage built a little higher. Each time, the sickening realization settled a little deeper into my bones. Someone was flying a drone over my farm in the middle of the night and poisoning my crops with herbicide, and they'd been getting away with it. But not anymore. I called Walt at 6 a.m. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been expecting this call. "Send me everything," he said. "Every frame, every audio file, every weather reading, and then I need you to do something that's going to be very difficult." "What?" "Act normal. Go about your day. Don't change your routine. Don't let anyone know you have this footage. The person doing this is watching you, and if they realize you're onto them, they'll destroy evidence, scrub their drone, and lawyer up before you can blink." I followed Walt's advice. I drove to Paducah. I celebrated my mother's birthday. I smiled and ate cake and acted like everything was fine. But underneath, I was seething. I was a volcano wearing a party hat. Over the next 2 weeks, the drone came back 3 more times. August 2nd, August 8th, and August 14th. Each time, my cameras captured clear footage. Each time, the drone approached from the east and departed to the east. Each time, it sprayed a different section of my specialty produce, once hitting my butternut squash, once targeting a new block of Roma tomatoes I'd replanted after the July damage, and once going after my green beans again. The pattern was methodical, calculated. This wasn't the work of some bored teenager with a hobby drone and a grudge. This was a campaign, a sustained, deliberate effort to destroy my farm's most valuable crops. And it was working. My total losses for the 2023 season would eventually exceed $210,000. $210,000 of produce, withered and dead, because some coward was flying over my land in the dark of night with a tank full of poison. Walt analyzed every frame of footage. Using the drone's size, flight characteristics, and the pattern of the spray, he identified it as likely a DJI Agras MG1 or MG1P, a commercial agricultural spraying drone with an 8-liter tank capacity and a spraying width of about 3 meters per pass. These are serious machines. They're used by commercial agricultural operations for precision spraying of large fields. They cost between $8,000 and $15,000. "You don't buy one of these at Best Buy," Walt told me. "They're available through agricultural equipment dealers, and every unit sold in the United States is registered with the FAA under the remote ID system. If we can get a clear enough image of the drone's registration number or serial number, we can trace it." But the infrared footage, while clear enough to show the drone's shape and behavior, wasn't sharp enough to read any markings on the aircraft. We had the flight path, the timing, and the spray pattern. We had the approach and departure directions. We had the herbicide samples from the affected plants, which a private lab confirmed were consistent with a dicamba-based formulation called Extendimax, a restricted-use herbicide that requires a certified applicator's license to purchase and apply. That was another crucial piece. In Kentucky, you can't just walk into a store and buy Extendi Max. You need to be a certified pesticide applicator, and every purchase is recorded. If we could find out who was buying this stuff and correlating those purchases with the timing of the attacks, we'd have a very strong circumstantial case even without the drone registration. Walt recommended I hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a specific lawyer named Patricia Harmon, who practiced agricultural law in Louisville and had a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys considered too complex or too rural to be worth the effort. "She's expensive," Walt warned me, "but she's brilliant, and she hates bullies." She represented a group of peach farmers in Indiana who were hit by illegal dicamba drift from a neighboring soybean operation, won them a $265 million verdict. I called Patricia Harmon on August 20th. She listened to my story for an hour without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You said the drone comes from the east," she said. "Who lives to the east of your property?" I told her. "Richard Callaway." I told her about his development plans, his repeated offers to buy my land, and my repeated refusals. I told her about the County Planning Commission meetings where Richard had presented his 600-acre development proposal, a proposal that was dead in the water without my 340 acres. "How much has he offered you?" Patricia asked. $2.4 million the first time, $3.1 million the second time, and $4.8 million 2 months ago. I turned them all down. $4.8 million for 340 acres of prime Kentucky farmland, Patricia mused. That's above market value, significantly above. He wants it bad. He wants it bad enough to destroy it first, Patricia said, and there was an edge to her voice that I hadn't heard before. If your crops are failing and you're hemorrhaging money, at some point selling starts to look like the only way out. That's the play. That's always the play. She took the case. Patricia's first move was to send a formal preservation letter to Richard Callaway. The letter, delivered by certified mail on September 1st, informed Richard that he was a potential witness in an ongoing investigation into crop damage on my property, and that he was legally required to preserve any and all evidence related to drone operations, herbicide purchases, and communications regarding my farm. The letter didn't accuse him of anything. It didn't name him as a suspect, but it put him on notice that someone was looking and that he needed to keep his records intact. We also filed a public records request with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture for all pesticide purchase records in Henderson County for the previous 2 years. This is public information. Anyone can request it, but it takes time to process. We also requested records from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, since Richard lived part-time in Nashville and could have purchased herbicide there. While we waited for the records to come through, Walt and I expanded the camera system. I bought 4 more trail cameras and 2 more cellular cameras, and we positioned them along the eastern border of my property, facing toward Callaway's land. If the drone came back, we'd have an even clearer picture of where it was coming from and where it was going. I also started doing something that Walt had suggested. I talked to other farmers in the area, quietly, carefully, without revealing what I knew. I just asked if anyone else had experienced unusual crop damage in the last couple of years, unexplained die-offs, mysterious herbicide symptoms, anything that didn't fit the usual pattern of disease, pests, or weather. What I found made my blood run cold. Tom Henderson, who farmed 280 acres south of my property, had lost a whole field of seed corn in 2022. He'd assumed it was a fungal infection, but when I described the symptoms I'd seen on my tomatoes, the curling, the mottling, the deformity, he went quiet for a long time. "That sounds exactly like what happened to my corn," he said. "The extension agent said it might be a virus, but we never confirmed it." Mine Win, whose family farmed 160 acres of mixed vegetables to the west, had lost 2 acres of cucumber plants in the spring of 2023. Same symptoms. She'd blamed it on contaminated compost. Old Mr. Kowalski had lost a hayfield. Phil and Sarah Brannigan, who operated a small organic farm 5 miles north, had lost an entire season of specialty greens. A young couple named the Garcias, who'd just started a U-pick strawberry operation on a leased parcel, had seen their entire first crop wither and die. I talked to 11 farmers in total. 11. Every single one of them had experienced unexplained crop damage in the previous 2 years. Every single one of them had property that Richard Calloway had tried to buy, and every single one of them had refused. The pattern was unmistakable, and it was massive. I called Patricia with what I'd found, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I heard something in her voice that gave me hope. It wasn't just confidence. It was anger. Cold, focused, lawyerly anger. "This is a RICO case," she said. "Racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. If Calloway has been systematically destroying multiple farmers' crops to force them off their land, that's not just crop damage, that's a criminal enterprise." "Can we prove it?" I asked. "We're going to try, but first, I need you to do something I should have asked you to do at the beginning. I need you to check the FAA drone registry." She explained that all drones weighing over 0.55 pounds must be registered with the FAA, and commercial drones like the DJI Agras must be registered under the remote ID system, which broadcasts the drone's registration number, location, altitude, and the location of the control station during flight. If Calloway's drone has remote ID, and it should because it's required by federal law, then every flight it makes is being recorded. The FAA keeps remote ID logs, and with a subpoena, we can get them. Patricia filed a motion for expedited discovery in circuit court on September 28, requesting access to Richard Calloway's FAA drone registration records, his Kentucky and Tennessee pesticide applicator licenses, and all purchase records for restricted-use herbicides. The judge, a woman named Martha Collins who'd grown up on a tobacco farm herself, granted the motion within 48 hours. The records arrived on October 12th, and they were devastating. Richard Calloway owned 2 drones registered with the FAA. One was a small DJI Mavic 3, a consumer photography drone. The other was a DJI Agras MG-1P, serial number 6STB4820R, commercial agricultural spraying drone. 8-liter tank, exactly what Walt had predicted. Calloway held a valid Kentucky pesticide applicator's license. He'd obtained it in March of 2022, 3 months before my first crop damage. He'd purchased 47 gallons of XtendiMax over the previous 18 months through 2 different agricultural supply companies, one in Henderson and one in Owensboro. 47 gallons. For an 80-acre property that he wasn't farming. The remote ID logs, obtained through a federal subpoena, showed 312 flight operations for the Agras drone between April 2022 and August 2023. The vast majority of these flights occurred between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., and a significant number of the flight paths overlapped with my property and the properties of at least 8 other farmers I'd spoken to. Patricia called me when she got the logs. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the satisfaction beneath it. "We have him," she said. "This is a slam dunk." Remote ID logs showing his drone flying over your property at 2 a.m. on every date that your cameras recorded the sprayings. Purchase records showing he bought 47 gallons of a restricted-use herbicide that he had no legitimate agricultural use for, and a clear financial motive. Your land is the linchpin of his development deal. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now comes the fun part," Patricia said. "We sue him. We report him to the Kentucky Department of Agriculture for illegal pesticide application. We report him to the FBI for using a drone to commit a federal crime. And we contact every other farmer he's done this to and ask them to join us. A class action? A class action. 11 plaintiffs, potentially more once word gets out. Agricultural vandalism, trespass, chemical contamination, emotional distress, punitive damages. We're going to hit him so hard his grandchildren will feel it." I can't lie, when she said that, I smiled for the first time in months. A real smile, the kind that starts somewhere deep in your chest and works its way up until your face hurts from it. But the story wasn't over, not even close. Richard Calloway was about to learn that the consequences of his actions went far beyond a lawsuit. The confrontation I'd been dreading, and secretly craving, came on October 28, 2023. Richard Calloway showed up at my farm unannounced, driving his silver BMW X5 down my gravel driveway like he owned the place. He parked in front of my barn, got out, and walked toward me with that easy smile he'd been perfecting for decades. I was in my workshop, cleaning my tractor attachments. I saw him coming through the open bay door and felt my whole body tense up. Every muscle, every nerve. 3 months of rage compressed into a single moment of electric hatred. "Hey neighbor," Richard called out, all charm and warmth. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing. Heard you've had some crop troubles this year. Tough break." I put down my wrench. I stood up. I looked him dead in the eyes, and I did not smile. "Tough break," I repeated. "Listen, I know this isn't the best time, but I wanted to talk to you about my offer, the 4.8 million. I've spoken with my investors, and we're willing to go to 5.5. That's a serious number for this amount of acreage, and I think you know it. I'm not selling, Richard. Everybody has a price. Not me." He shifted his weight, the smile flickered, just for a second, and I saw something beneath it. Something cold and calculating. Something that confirmed everything I already knew. All I'm saying is, farming is a tough business. Bad years happen, one after another, and pretty soon you're drowning in debt with nothing to show for it. A man's got to be practical about these things. Is that a threat, Richard? It's friendly advice, from someone who cares about this community. "I think you care about one thing," I said. "Your development deal. And I think you've been doing a lot more than giving friendly advice to make it happen." The smile vanished completely. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. The air between us was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard said. But his voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was left was flat and hard and just a little bit scared. "Then you won't mind if I tell you that I have video footage of a DJI Agras MG1P, serial number 6STB48200R, registered to you with the FAA, flying over my property at 2:47 a.m. on July 24th, spraying what lab analysis has confirmed is Extendimax, a restricted-use herbicide that you purchased 47 gallons of over the past 18 months, for reasons I'm very curious to hear you explain." The color drained from Richard Calloway's face. It was one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed in my entire life. His jaw dropped. His eyes went wide. For one glorious, crystalline moment, the mask came off completely, and I saw the real Richard Calloway, the desperate, cornered man who had poisoned my crops and my neighbor's crops and thought he could get away with it. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Those cameras, you can't." 312 flights, Richard. Recorded by the FAA remote ID system. Over my property, Tom Henderson's property, Anunguan's property, the Kowalski's property, and at least 5 others. We have the logs, we have the purchase records, we have the video, we have the herbicide analysis, and we have a lawyer who is, at this very moment, preparing a class action lawsuit with 11 plaintiffs. His hand found the door handle of his BMW, and he pulled it open with a shaking grip. "This isn't over," he said, but the words came out weak, pathetic. The desperate bluff of a man who'd just realized that his entire scheme was crumbling around him. "Oh, Richard," I said, leaning against the doorframe of my workshop with my arms crossed. "It's so very, very over." He drove away so fast he left tire marks on my gravel driveway. I watched him go, and then I went inside and poured myself the largest glass of bourbon I've ever poured. I sat at my kitchen table and drank it slowly, savoring every drop, savoring the memory of the look on his face. It was the best bourbon I've ever tasted. Patricia filed the class action lawsuit on November 15, 2023. The defendants were Richard Calloway, his real estate development company, Calloway Capital Partners, LLC, and the company he'd hired to manage his agricultural land holdings, Bluegrass Land Management, LLC. The plaintiffs were me and 10 other farming families from Henderson County. The complaint was 94 pages long. It alleged agricultural vandalism, trespass, conspiracy to commit agricultural vandalism, violation of Kentucky's pesticide application laws, violation of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, intentional interference with business relations, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The total damages claimed were $4.7 million in actual losses, plus an unspecified amount in punitive damages. The lawsuit made the local news within hours. The Henderson Gazette ran a front-page story with the headline, "Drone Attacks on Farms, Developer Accused of Chemical Warfare." The Louisville Courier-Journal picked it up the next day, then the AP, then CNN, then the Today Show. Richard Callaway, who had spent his entire career cultivating an image as a philanthropic community leader and successful businessman, became a national symbol of corporate greed and agricultural terrorism. His face was on every news channel, his development company's website crashed and was taken offline. The County Planning Commission, which had been considering his development proposal for 5 years, suspended all review of his projects pending the outcome of the litigation. But the lawsuit was only half the battle. The other half was criminal. So, on November 30th, 2023, I received a phone call from the Henderson County Commonwealth's attorney, a man named David Pratt. He'd been following the civil case and had been in contact with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture's Enforcement Division. "We're filing criminal charges," Pratt told me. 3 counts of criminal trespass, 11 counts of agricultural vandalism, 1 for each farm, and 11 counts of violation of the Kentucky Pesticide Use Act. Each count of agricultural vandalism carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in state prison and a $10,000 fine. Richard Callaway was arrested on December 8, 2023. He was booked into the Henderson County Detention Center at 9:14 p.m. and released on a $200,000 bond at 6 a.m. the following morning. I wasn't there for the arrest, but a deputy sheriff who was involved told me later that Callaway had been physically ill during the booking process. He'd thrown up in the booking area. Whether it was from fear, guilt, or just the smell of the detention center, I couldn't say. But I enjoyed hearing about it either way. The criminal case moved slowly, as criminal cases do: discovery, motions, continuances. Richard's lawyers, a team of 6 attorneys from a high-priced firm in Louisville, filed motion after motion trying to suppress the evidence. They argued that the trail camera footage was obtained without a warrant. They argued that the FAA remote ID logs were improperly obtained. They argued that the pesticide purchase records violated Richard's Fourth Amendment rights. Judge Collins denied every single motion. Every one. Her rulings were thorough, well-reasoned, and repeatedly affirmed one central principle: Richard Callaway had no reasonable expectation of privacy while flying a drone over someone else's property at 2 a.m. to commit a crime. Meanwhile, Patricia's civil case was moving forward on a parallel track. During depositions, we discovered something that even Walt hadn't anticipated. Richard hadn't acted alone. His farm manager, a man named Derek Sweeney, had been the actual drone operator. Derek was a licensed pilot, both manned aircraft and drones, and he'd been flying Richard's Agras drone on those midnight missions, spraying herbicide on farm after farm after farm, while Richard sat in his study in Nashville, reviewing the results and planning the next attack. Derek had been paid $75,000 over the course of 18 months for what Richard's records euphemistically described as aerial agricultural services. That's $75,000 to poison crops in the dead of night. A nice little side gig if you have no conscience whatsoever. When Derek was deposed in January 2024, he broke. Completely. He sat in that conference room across from Patricia and 2 of her associates, and he told them everything. The targets, the timing, the herbicide formulations, the flight paths. He told them Richard had given him a list of properties and a schedule. He told them Richard had provided the drone, the herbicide, and the GPS coordinates for each farm's most valuable crops. He told them Richard had promised him a partnership in the development company once the land was assembled. He told them he believed Richard was going to make him a millionaire. And then he started crying. "I know what I did was wrong," Derek said, his voice cracking. "I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, but I needed the money. My wife was sick, and the medical bills were... I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you why I did it. Richard convinced me these were bad farmers who were going to lose their land anyway. He said the development would bring jobs and tax revenue to the county. He said I was helping the community, not hurting it." Patricia asked him if Richard had ever expressed any concern about the environmental consequences of spraying herbicide in residential areas, near waterways, and on land he didn't own. Derek laughed. A bitter, hollow laugh. Richard doesn't think about consequences. Richard thinks about money. Derek agreed to cooperate with the criminal prosecution in exchange for a plea deal. He pled guilty to 11 misdemeanor counts of illegal pesticide application and received 2 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service, and a requirement to surrender his pilot's license. Richard Calloway was not offered a plea deal. The criminal trial began on April 15, 2024, in the Henderson County Circuit Court. It lasted 9 days. I sat in the courtroom every single day, from beginning to end, alongside Tom Henderson, Mai Nguyen, and 6 other farmers from the case. The prosecution called 14 witnesses. Walt Briggs testified as an expert witness, walking the jury through the drone footage frame by frame. Darlene Moss testified about the herbicide symptoms she'd observed on my crops and the crops of other affected farmers. A forensic chemist from the private lab testified about the XtendiMax analysis. An FAA official testified about the remote ID system and the flight logs. And then Derek Sweeney testified against Richard Calloway. For 3 hours, Derek sat in that witness chair and laid out the entire conspiracy. The planning meetings in Richard's Nashville office, the purchase of the drone and the herbicide, the midnight flights, the careful selection of targets based on their refusal to sell, the escalating frequency of the attacks, as Richard grew more desperate to assemble his development tract. Richard sat at the defense table with his jaw clenched and his face flushed. His attorneys objected 17 times during Derek's testimony. The judge sustained 11 of those objections and overruled 6. But the damage was done. The jury had heard everything. They'd heard it from the man who had actually carried out the attacks. The defense's case lasted 2 days. Richard's attorneys tried to cast Derek as a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. They tried to argue that the drone footage was inconclusive. They tried to suggest that the herbicide damage could have been caused by conventional drift from legitimate agricultural operations. On cross-examination, Patricia, who'd been sitting at the prosecution table as a consultant, asked Richard's own expert witness, an agronomist from Indiana, a single question that demolished the entire defense. "Doctor, is there any legitimate agricultural reason for a person to fly a commercial spraying drone over a neighboring farmer's property at 2 a.m. without that farmer's knowledge or consent?" The agronomist paused. He looked at the defense table. He looked at the judge. He looked at the jury. "No," he said, "there is not." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held on June 3, 2024. Judge Collins, who had presided over the trial, had a reputation for handing down tough sentences in agricultural cases, and she did not disappoint. Richard Calloway was sentenced to 12 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary with eligibility for parole after 8. He was fined $275,000. His pesticide applicator's license was permanently revoked, his drone registration was canceled, and he was ordered to pay $4.7 million in restitution to the 11 farming families whose crops he had destroyed. When the judge read the sentence, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard's wife, who had been sitting in the gallery every day of the trial, began sobbing. Richard himself stood at the defense table with his hands gripping the rail, his knuckles white, his face ashen. He looked at me one time as the bailiffs led him away. One time. His eyes met mine across the courtroom, and in that gaze, I saw something I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was understanding. He finally, fully understood what he had done, not just to me, but to his wife, to his reputation, to his freedom, to his entire life. He threw it all away for 340 acres of Kentucky farmland. And then he was gone, led through the door at the back of the courtroom, and I never saw him again. But the story doesn't end there. Because while the criminal case was winding its way through the courts, Patricia's civil litigation team had been doing something extraordinary. They'd been investigating the environmental impact of Richard's herbicide campaign, and what they found was catastrophic. Remember those 47 gallons of Extendimax? When you spray that much dicamba-based herbicide over a 2-year period, from a drone, at night, in an uncontrolled and unregulated manner, the chemical doesn't just affect the target crops. It drifts, it settles, it seeps into the soil, it runs off into waterways during rainstorms, it accumulates. An environmental consulting firm hired by Patricia's team conducted a comprehensive soil and water analysis on Richard Callaway's 80-acre property and the surrounding area. They found elevated levels of dicamba residue in the soil at concentrations 15 to 40 times the EPA's established tolerance levels. They found dicamba contamination in the creek that ran along the eastern border of my property, the same creek that fed into the Green River watershed. They found contamination on Richard's own property, the property he'd been planning to develop into a 600-acre commercial and residential paradise. Under Kentucky environmental law, once a property is contaminated with agricultural chemicals above established tolerance levels, it must be remediated before any development can occur. Remediation of dicamba-contaminated soil typically involves removal of the top 12 to 24 inches of soil, treatment with activated carbon or other absorbent materials, and replacement with clean fill. For 80 acres, the estimated cost was $3.2 million. $3.2 million. And that was just Richard's property. The contamination had spread to portions of my land and several neighboring farms. Patricia filed an additional claim for environmental remediation costs, bringing the total civil damages sought to over $8 million. The EPA got involved. The Kentucky Department of Environmental Protection got involved. The Army Corps of Engineers got involved because of the creek contamination and its connection to the Green River watershed. Richard Callaway's 600-acre development project, the project he had spent years planning, the project he had destroyed livelihoods and committed felonies to make possible, was officially dead, not delayed, not scaled back, dead, permanently. Because you can't build a residential community on contaminated soil. You can't get permits for development when the EPA has flagged your property for dicamba remediation. And you can't convince investors to pour money into a project that's been splashed across national news as the centerpiece of a criminal agricultural poisoning conspiracy. The irony was so perfect, so exquisitely poetic, that I almost couldn't believe it. Richard Callaway had poisoned my crops to force me off my land so he could build his dream development. And in doing so, he had poisoned his own land so thoroughly that no development would ever be possible there. He had destroyed himself with the very weapon he'd used against us. The civil case settled in September 2024. Before it could go to trial, Richard's insurers, who had been trying to disclaim coverage since the criminal conviction, ultimately agreed to a settlement of $7.2 million. That included $4.7 million in compensatory damages for crop losses, $1.5 million for environmental remediation on affected properties, and $1 million in punitive damages. My share of the settlement was $1.34 million. Tom Henderson got $890,000. Mai Nguyen got $620,000. The other farmers received amounts ranging from $180,000 to $540,000, depending on their individual losses. But the money, as satisfying as it was, wasn't the best part. The best part was what happened to Richard's land. With his development dreams shattered, his company in ruins, and his personal finances devastated by the criminal and civil judgments, the 80-acre Callaway farm went into foreclosure. The bank that held the mortgage put it up for auction in February 2025. I bought it. I stood in the Henderson County Courthouse on a cold February morning and bid $620,000 for the 80 acres that Richard Callaway had used as the launching pad for his campaign of agricultural terrorism. Nobody else bid. Nobody else wanted land that was under EPA remediation orders, but I wanted it. I wanted it more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. Because I knew something that nobody else in that courtroom knew. I knew that the remediation, while expensive, was not permanent. Dicamba breaks down in soil over time, especially with proper treatment. And the environmental consultants had told me that with 2 to 3 years of managed cover cropping and soil amendment, the land would be productive again. My land. 340 acres plus 80 more, 420 acres of Kentucky farmland, held by the same family for 3 generations, and soon to be 4. I planted my first crop on the Callaway acreage, my acreage, in the spring of 2025. Cover crops, mostly, clover, winter rye, and daikon radish, to break up the compacted soil and start pulling the residual herbicide out of the ground. It will take time, but the land is patient, and so am I. I think about my father every day. I think about the promise I made to him at his funeral, standing beside his casket with the tractors idling in the distance. I promised him I would never sell. Not 1 acre, not to anyone, not for any price. I kept that promise. It cost me more than I ever imagined it would. 2 years of sleepless nights, $210,000 in crop losses, months of anxiety that ate away at my health and my relationships. The emotional toll of knowing that someone I'd trusted was systematically destroying everything I cared about. But I also got something I never expected. I got justice, not the quiet, measured, procedural kind of justice that the legal system promises and so rarely delivers. I got the loud, dramatic, absolutely devastating kind of justice that you read about in novels and think could never happen in real life. A man tried to steal my land. He poisoned my crops. He poisoned my neighbor's crops. He used a drone to do it in the dead of night, like a coward, like a thief, like the worst kind of villain. And he got caught. He got convicted. He went to prison. His company was destroyed. His development dreams were annihilated. And I bought his farm at auction for 62 cents on the dollar. If this were a movie, you wouldn't believe the ending. You'd say it was too neat, too satisfying, too perfectly engineered. But sometimes life writes a better story than any screenwriter could dream up. My farm is thriving. The remediation is progressing ahead of schedule. My tomatoes are growing tall and green and beautiful, and every single one of them is a middle finger aimed at the memory of Richard Callaway. Tom Henderson and I have started a farmers' cooperative with 6 of the other plaintiffs. We're pooling resources, sharing equipment, and building something that Richard Callaway could never destroy, a community of independent farmers who look out for each other. Mine Win put her settlement money into an organic certification program. She's now the only certified organic vegetable grower in the county, and her produce sells at a premium at farmers markets all over western Kentucky. Old Mr. Kowalski, who is 87 years old and still farming 120 acres by himself, used his settlement to buy a new tractor. He drove it over to my place the day after he got it, beaming with pride, and let me take it for a spin around the field. That man can still drive a tractor better than anyone I've ever met. Derek Sweeney completed his community service and got a job at a hardware store in Owensboro. His wife's health improved, and he sends me a letter every few months. In the last one, he wrote, "I know I can never undo what I did, but I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I haven't forgiven him. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I won't. That's not something anyone gets to decide but me." If you're reading this and you're a farmer, I want you to take one thing away from this story. Trust your instincts. When something doesn't look right, when the damage doesn't match the explanation, when your gut tells you that something is wrong, listen to it. Install cameras, document everything, talk to your neighbors, and don't ever let anyone convince you that your land isn't worth fighting for. My grandfather pulled stumps out of this soil with his bare hands. My father worked through droughts and floods and the worst agricultural crisis in modern American history. And I stood in a courtroom and watched the man who tried to destroy everything my family built get led away in handcuffs. This land is my legacy. It's my birthright. It's the only thing in this world that I would truly, genuinely, lay down my life to protect. And if anyone ever tries to take it from me again, whether with a briefcase full of money or a drone full of poison, they will learn the same lesson that Richard Callaway learned. You don't mess with a farmer. Not on our land. Not on our watch. Not ever. Edit. A lot of people have been asking for updates, so here are a few. Richard Callaway is currently incarcerated at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. His projected parole date is 2032. His wife filed for divorce in March 2025. His development company, Callaway Capital Partners, was formally dissolved in January 2025. His Louisville attorneys dropped him as a client after the conviction. And his last remaining legal team, a public defender appointed for his bankruptcy proceedings, told the court that Richard has no remaining assets of significant value. The EPA completed the Phase 1 environmental site assessment of the former Callaway property in April 2025. The remediation plan was approved in June, and work is underway. The projected completion date is fall of 2027. I've already started planting cover crops on the sections that have been cleared, and the soil tests are looking better than expected. The land is healing. The class action attorneys are exploring additional claims against the agricultural supply companies that sold Richard the XtendiMax. Under federal law, restricted-use pesticides can only be sold to certified applicators who have a legitimate need for the product. Selling 47 gallons of XtendiMax to a real estate developer with no active farming operation raises some very interesting questions about those companies' sales practices. That case is still in the early stages, but I'll update when I know more. The Henderson County Planning Commission formally rejected the 600-acre development proposal in November 2024, citing the environmental contamination, the criminal convictions, and the overwhelming opposition from the agricultural community. The proposal cannot be resubmitted for 5 years under county zoning rules, and even then, the contamination issue would need to be fully resolved. My farm is doing better than ever. The 2025 tomato crop is the best I've ever grown, and I've expanded my specialty produce operation to 60 acres. The cooperative is thriving. We've hired 2 full-time employees and are looking at opening our own processing facility next year. And the cameras? They're still up, every one of them. They'll stay up forever, as far as I'm concerned. Not because I'm expecting trouble. The trouble is over, locked away in a prison cell, 200 miles from here. But because a farmer should always be watching, always be ready, always be protecting what's theirs. My father taught me that. His father taught him. And one day, if I'm lucky enough to have kids of my own, I'll teach them too. This land is ours. And nobody, not Richard Callaway, not any developer, not any corporation with deep pockets and shallow morals, is ever going to take it from us. Thank you for reading, and if you're a farmer, go check your crops, right now. Trust your gut. Edit 2. For everyone asking, yes, the footage has been made public as part of the court record. You can find clips from the trail cameras on several news sites. The infrared footage of the drone flying over my tomato field at 2:47 a.m. is particularly striking. It's been viewed over 14 million times on Twitter alone. Also, I've been contacted by a documentary production company that wants to do a feature-length film about the case. I'm considering it. If it helps other farmers protect themselves, I'm in. Stay vigilant, everyone, and support your local farmers. Story 2. An airline lost my checked bag containing a camera I use for freelance photography work, valued at just over $3,000 and less than a year old. And when I filed the claim, they offered me $210, citing a depreciation schedule that treated professional camera equipment as losing value at roughly the same aggressive rate as, apparently by their own written policy, a pair of running shoes, a comparison so absurd once I actually got them to send me their depreciation methodology in writing that it became the center of how I eventually got a fair settlement instead. I want to describe the actual loss first, since understanding what was in that bag matters for the rest of this. I was traveling for a paid photography assignment, checked a bag containing my primary camera body and 2 lenses, insured items I use professionally, packed according to the airline's own stated guidelines for checked equipment, declared at check-in as containing camera equipment per their own request during the check-in process. The bag never arrived at my destination, and after the standard delayed baggage tracking window passed without any update, it was formally declared lost. I filed the airline's standard lost baggage claim, providing the original purchase receipt for the camera body, showing it was 10 months old at the time of loss, along with receipts for both lenses, submitting a total claimed value of just over $3,100, reflecting the actual combined purchase price of the equipment. The airline's initial response offered $210, an amount so far below the actual value that I genuinely assumed, at first, this had to be some kind of processing error, perhaps reflecting only a portion of my claim, or missing some of the documentation I'd submitted. I called to clarify, and the representative confirmed this was, in fact, their full and final offer for the entire claimed loss, citing an internal depreciation schedule applied to all checked baggage claims regardless of item category. I want to describe the specific frustration of trying to actually understand this depreciation methodology, since the representative I spoke with initially could not or would not explain the specific calculation beyond confirming that a depreciation schedule existed and had been applied, treating the resulting number as simply the airline's standard, non-negotiable practice for any claim of this nature. I formally requested, in writing, a complete copy of the specific depreciation methodology applied to my claim, citing my right as a consumer to understand the basis for a settlement offer regarding property the airline itself had lost through its own baggage handling process. This request took several rounds of escalation, an initial refusal citing internal policy, followed by persistence on my part specifically framing the request around applicable consumer protection and, since this was a domestic flight, the specific Federal Aviation Consumer Protection Framework that governs baggage liability and requires airlines to maintain and, upon request, disclose the basis for their claim settlement calculations. Once I actually obtained the depreciation schedule itself, the specific detail that changed everything about how I approached this dispute became clear. The airline's internal schedule categorized checked items into broad general categories for depreciation purposes, and camera equipment, rather than being treated as its own distinct category reflecting how professional photography equipment actually holds value over time, had been lumped into a broad general electronics and personal items category that included, among other things, a depreciation curve nearly identical to what was applied to items like footwear and general clothing accessories, categories that genuinely do lose the vast majority of their resale value within the first year of ownership, in a way that camera equipment, particularly professional-grade equipment from established manufacturers, simply does not. I want to describe why this specific categorization was so clearly, demonstrably wrong, rather than merely unfavorable to me. Professional camera equipment maintains a well-documented, actively tracked secondary resale market, with actual comparable sale prices readily available through several established used camera equipment marketplaces and price guide services, specifically because this category of equipment holds value in a fundamentally different way than fast-depreciating consumer goods like footwear, something any camera equipment dealer or knowledgeable photographer would immediately recognize, and something I was able to document concretely by pulling actual, contemporaneous sale listings for the identical camera body and lens models in comparable condition, all showing resale values considerably closer to 70 or 80% of original purchase price at 10 months of age, rather than the roughly 7% implied by the airline's applied settlement offer. I compiled this comparison directly, the airline's own written depreciation methodology applied to my specific items, against actual, documented comparable resale market data for the identical equipment, and submitted a formal appeal specifically arguing that the depreciation category applied to my claim was factually inappropriate for this specific type of property, providing the comparable market data as direct evidentiary support for a revised, fair settlement amount. I want to describe the airline's response to this more specific, evidence-based appeal, since it differed considerably from the initial vague, take-it-or-leave-it posture of the original offer. Once presented with actual comparable market data directly contradicting their applied depreciation category, along with a clear articulation of why camera equipment should reasonably fall under a different, considerably more conservative depreciation treatment than general consumer electronics or accessories, the claims department engaged more seriously, requesting additional documentation regarding the specific market comparables I'd provided, which I supplied in full. This internal reconsideration process took several more weeks, but ultimately resulted in a revised settlement offer considerably closer to actual fair market value, though I want to be honest, it still fell somewhat short of my full claimed amount, landing at roughly $2,400 once negotiations concluded, reflecting some continued depreciation for the equipment's age and condition, but grounded in an actually defensible methodology rather than the original, clearly inappropriate category application. I want to describe the additional step I took beyond the direct negotiation, since I think it mattered for ensuring accountability beyond just my own individual settlement. I filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division, which specifically tracks and can investigate airline baggage liability practices. Providing the full documentation trail, the original inappropriate depreciation categorization, the comparable market data I'd used to demonstrate the error, and the airline's own eventual, considerably improved settlement once presented with that evidence. Specifically flagging this as a broader concerning pattern in how the airline's depreciation methodology handled professional equipment categories generally, rather than framing it purely as a complaint about my own individual claim resolution. I don't know the full scope of whatever broader regulatory review that complaint may have contributed to, since the department does not typically share detailed outcomes of broader methodology reviews with individual complainants, but I did receive a formal acknowledgement confirming my complaint had been logged and would be considered as part of the department's ongoing oversight of airline baggage liability practices generally, which felt like a meaningful, if modest, contribution toward addressing what seemed, once I actually saw the airline's own internal categorization scheme in writing, like a systemic issue likely affecting other travelers with professional equipment claims well beyond just my own specific situation. I want to end on the practical lesson, since I think it applies to anyone who travels with any kind of specialized, professional, or otherwise unusually value-retaining equipment. If an airline's lost baggage settlement offer seems dramatically disproportionate to your item's actual, real-world value, request their specific written depreciation methodology directly, rather than simply negotiating in the abstract. Since airlines are generally required, under applicable consumer protection frameworks, to disclose the actual basis for a settlement calculation upon a properly framed request. And once you have that specific methodology in hand, comparing it directly against actual, documented, comparable resale market data for your specific item category is often the single most effective tool available for demonstrating, concretely rather than just through frustrated argument, exactly why a given settlement offer fails to reflect your property's genuine, real-world value. Story 3. My ex-husband submitted a packet of screenshots to our custody evaluator, showing me supposedly refusing to communicate about our son's medical needs and dismissing his concerns in a series of messages sent through the court-ordered co-parenting communication app we were both required to use. Messages I had no memory of ever sending, and that, once I requested the platform's own official records export rather than relying on his submitted screenshots, turned out to have been edited, specific words changed, and entire sentences added to my actual original messages before he screenshotted and printed them for the evaluator. I want to explain why we were using this specific app in the first place, since it matters for understanding why what happened felt so specifically maddening. Our custody arrangement, established after a genuinely difficult divorce, included a requirement that all co-parenting communication happen exclusively through a specific, court-recommended app designed precisely for high-conflict situations, one that logs every message with a timestamp and, notably, is specifically marketed and designed around tamper-resistant, admissible record-keeping, precisely because it's built for exactly the kind of situation where messages might later matter in a legal proceeding. The custody evaluation itself had been triggered by a disagreement over our son's ongoing therapy schedule, a genuinely reasonable, if tense, disagreement that had escalated to the point where both of our attorneys agreed a neutral evaluator's input would help resolve things properly. As part of that evaluation process, both my ex, I'll call him Trevor, and I were asked to submit relevant communication history supporting our respective positions regarding how cooperatively or uncooperatively each of us had actually been engaging on this specific issue. I submitted my own screenshots, taken directly from the app on my own phone, showing what I remembered as a reasonably cooperative, if occasionally tense, back and forth regarding scheduling logistics. Trevor submitted his own set of screenshots, and this is where I first encountered a version of a conversation I genuinely did not recognize. Messages attributed to me that included specific phrases I was certain I had never written, dismissive language about our son's therapist's recommendations, and a flatly refused tone regarding a specific schedule change he'd proposed, phrased in a way that painted a picture of me as considerably more obstructive and dismissive than I believed my actual messages had ever been. I want to describe the specific disorientation of reading messages attributed to yourself that you have no memory of writing, a genuinely unsettling experience that made me briefly, seriously wonder whether I was somehow misremembering my own communication style during a period that had, admittedly, been stressful for both of us. I went back to my own phone, pulled up the actual conversation thread within the app itself, and compared it directly against the specific screenshots Trevor had submitted. The discrepancy, once I actually laid the two versions side by side, was unmistakable. Several of my actual messages, still visible and unedited within my own app on my own device, differed in specific, meaningful ways from what appeared in Trevor's submitted screenshots, additional sentences appended that I had never written, and, in a couple of instances, specific words within my actual sentences, swapped for different words entirely, changes subtle enough in formatting and font to look completely natural within a screenshot, but definitively, provably different from what my own device showed as the actual message I had sent and that remained visible in my own conversation history. I want to describe how I approached this next step, since I understood immediately that this needed to be handled with real care given how serious an accusation, deliberately fabricating evidence for a custody evaluation, actually is, and given that a screenshot comparison alone, my phone's version against his submitted version, still ultimately came down to my word against a printed document, without some kind of independent, third-party verification establishing definitively which version was accurate. This is where the specific design of the court-ordered co-parenting app turned out to matter enormously. I contacted the platform's own customer support and, separately, had my attorney send a formal request specifically asking for an official, platform-generated export of our complete message history for the relevant date range, a feature these specific court-recommended communication platforms are generally built to provide precisely because they're designed with exactly this kind of legal dispute in mind, maintaining their own independent, unmodifiable server-side record of every message exactly as originally sent and received, regardless of what either party might screenshot, print, or otherwise represent afterward. That official export, once obtained, showed my actual, original messages exactly as I remembered writing them and exactly as they still appeared on my own device, definitively different from the specific edited versions Trevor had submitted to the evaluator. This was not a case of dueling, equally uncertain screenshots anymore. It was my own device's stored history and the platform's own independent, authoritative server record, both agreeing with each other and both directly contradicting the specific document Trevor had submitted as evidence. I want to describe bringing this to my attorney, since her reaction confirmed how seriously this needed to be treated. Submitting fabricated evidence to a court-ordered custody evaluator is not simply an ordinary discovery dispute. It potentially implicates much more serious consequences, since knowingly presenting altered evidence in a legal proceeding can constitute a form of fraud on the court, or even, depending on the specific jurisdiction and circumstances, criminal conduct, well beyond the underlying custody dispute itself. My attorney formally submitted the platform's official export directly to both the custody evaluator and the court, alongside a clear, documented comparison specifically highlighting the discrepancies between Trevor's submitted screenshots and the platform's own independently maintained record, framing this not as a mere disagreement about tone or interpretation, but as a specific, demonstrable instance of evidence tampering. I want to describe the evaluator's reaction, since it shifted the entire trajectory of the custody evaluation considerably. Rather than treating this as simply one more contested detail in a high-conflict co-parenting dispute, the evaluator, once shown the specific, verified discrepancy between the official platform record and Trevor's submitted screenshots, treated the fabrication itself as directly and significantly relevant to the underlying question the evaluation existed to assess, namely each parent's actual credibility and good faith cooperation, since a parent willing to fabricate evidence regarding co-parenting communication raises serious, direct questions about that same parent's broader reliability and trustworthiness in exactly the kind of ongoing cooperative decision making a shared custody arrangement requires. Trevor's attorney, once confronted with the platform's own official export directly contradicting his client's submitted evidence, did not have a credible alternative explanation to offer. And Trevor himself, when directly questioned about the discrepancy during a subsequent hearing, was unable to provide any coherent account of how his submitted screenshots could differ so specifically from both my own device's record and the platform's own independent server log, an admission that, functionally, the evaluator and eventually the court treated as confirming the fabrication had indeed occurred as I documented. I want to describe the actual custody outcome, since I think it's important to be honest that this specific fabrication, once exposed, became one significant factor among several the court ultimately weighed, rather than instantly and single-handedly resolving every disputed issue in our broader custody arrangement in my favor. The court did modify certain aspects of our parenting time and decision-making authority in ways that reflected the evaluator's now informed assessment of each of our respective credibility and cooperative good faith, changes that meaningfully benefited my position on the specific issues that had originally prompted the evaluation. Though I want to be honest that our broader co-parenting relationship remains, unsurprisingly, a genuinely difficult one, that this single incident, however consequential, did not simply resolve entirely on its own. I want to end on the practical lesson here, since I think it matters for anyone navigating a co-parenting situation using any kind of court-recommended communication platform. If you are ever presented with screenshots attributed to your own past communication that you don't fully recognize or remember accurately, do not simply assume your own memory must be at fault. Request the platform's own official, independently generated export directly, a feature these specific court-ordered communication tools are generally built to provide, precisely because they anticipate exactly this kind of dispute, and that official, third-party verified record, rather than any printed or screenshotted document either party might submit independently, is what actually holds up as reliable, authoritative evidence when it matters most. Story 4. My father, a veteran struggling with a service-connected injury for years, paid a self-described veterans benefits consultant 25% of his very first disability back payment, just over $11,000, for help filing a claim that once I actually looked into it properly, he could have gotten identical help with completely free of charge through several legitimate channels specifically established for exactly this purpose, and the consultant's fee arrangement itself turned out to violate a specific federal law limiting exactly what this category of assistance is legally allowed to charge. I want to explain the background here, since understanding how my father ended up in this situation matters for why I think this specific type of predatory practice continues to find victims despite fairly clear legal protections existing on paper. He'd struggled for years with a service-connected back injury, had attempted, unsuccessfully, to navigate the disability claims process on his own, a couple of times previously, receiving denials that, like a lot of legitimate claims, likely resulted more from incomplete documentation or an inadequately supported initial application than from any lack of an actual, valid underlying disability, a common enough outcome that plenty of legitimate veteran assistance organizations exist specifically to help veterans build a properly documented, well-supported claim the first time. The consultant he found, I'll call the company Veteran Claims Advantage, advertised aggressively toward veterans specifically, promising expert help navigating what is, genuinely, a complex bureaucratic process, and structuring their fee not as an upfront payment, which might have triggered more scrutiny, but as a percentage of whatever back payment my father would eventually receive if the claim succeeded, a structure that, on its face, sounds almost reasonable, no cost if we don't win your case, a contingency arrangement familiar to anyone who's dealt with personal injury attorneys operating on similar terms. I want to explain what my father did not know, and what I did not know either until I started actually researching this after the fact, which is that federal law specifically and tightly regulates who is legally permitted to charge any fee at all for helping a veteran prepare, present, or pursue an initial disability compensation claim before the Department of Veterans Affairs. Specifically, charging a fee for assistance with an initial claim, as opposed to certain later-stage appeals processes where accredited attorneys and claims agents can legally charge fees under specific, regulated circumstances, is generally prohibited entirely, precisely because Congress and the VA have long recognized that veterans navigating this system are a uniquely vulnerable population deserving of protection from exactly the kind of predatory fee arrangement my father entered into. I want to describe how I actually discovered this, since it happened almost by accident during an unrelated conversation. I mentioned to a coworker, in passing, that my father had finally gotten his disability claim approved after years of trying, mentioning the consultant's fee as an aside, a genuinely significant chunk of his very first, badly needed back payment. My coworker, whose own spouse is a veteran and who had used a completely different, free resource for a similar claim, reacted with visible surprise, asking directly whether my father had known that this kind of paid assistance for an initial claim was actually illegal under federal law, a question I had genuinely never considered, having simply assumed, the way my father had, that paying for expert help with a complicated government process was a normal, legitimate transaction. That conversation sent me down a research path that confirmed exactly what my coworker had described. Veterans service organizations, accredited by the VA specifically for this purpose, groups connected to major veteran advocacy organizations along with state and county veteran service officers, provide exactly this kind of claim preparation assistance entirely free of charge, funded through their own organizational structures rather than through any fee charged to the veteran, precisely because Congress specifically intended for this kind of help to be universally accessible regardless of a veteran's financial situation, and structured the law to prohibit exactly the kind of for-profit fee arrangement my father had entered into for this specific stage of the process. I want to describe the conversation with my father once I explained this, since it was genuinely difficult in a way I hadn't anticipated, having to tell a proud man who'd finally, after years of frustration, gotten a legitimate claim approved, that the $11,000 he'd paid for that help had been taken from him through what amounted to an illegal fee arrangement, information that made him feel, understandably, both angry at having been taken advantage of and a little embarrassed at not having known better. A combination of feelings I worked hard to help him see wasn't a reflection of any failure on his part, since this specific predatory practice depends entirely on veterans, reasonably not knowing the specific legal fee restrictions that exist for exactly this stage of the claims process. Restrictions that are not exactly widely publicized in a way that would naturally reach someone in his position before he'd already committed to paying. I want to walk through what we actually did once we understood the situation clearly, since pursuing this properly required understanding the specific regulatory and legal channels that actually apply here, distinct from an ordinary consumer fraud complaint. We filed a formal complaint with the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of General Counsel, specifically citing the fee charged for initial claim assistance, and identifying it as a violation of the specific federal statute governing exactly what fees are and are not legally permissible at each stage of the VA claims process, providing the consultant's own fee agreement documentation and my father's original claim timeline as supporting evidence. We also filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, since deceptive practices targeting veterans specifically, including charging fees prohibited under federal law while marketing that assistance as legitimate expert help, fall within the FTC's broader consumer protection mandate, and separately, given the scale of what this company appeared to be charging across what we suspected, correctly as it turned out, was likely a broader pattern rather than an isolated instance involving just my father, we reached out to a veterans legal aid organization specifically experienced in exactly this category of predatory practice targeting veterans. That legal aid organization, once we explained the situation, confirmed they had, in fact, received other complaints regarding this same consultant company, and helped us pursue a formal demand for repayment of the illegally charged fee, citing the specific federal prohibition along with connecting our complaint to what became, once several other affected veterans' accounts were compared and combined through that same organization's ongoing tracking of complaints against this specific company, a broader pattern investigation involving considerably more than just my father's individual case. I want to describe the resolution, since it took real persistence over several months to actually achieve. The VA's Office of General Counsel, once presented with clear documentation of the illegal fee arrangement, confirmed the violation and referred the matter for further action, while the combined pressure from multiple veterans' complaints coordinated through the legal aid organization ultimately resulted in the consultant company agreeing to refund the illegally charged fees to affected veterans identified through that combined complaint process, including my father's full $11,000, paid back over a structured timeline rather than in one immediate lump sum, but fully recovered. I want to describe what happened to the company itself beyond the individual refunds, since this mattered to us considerably, beyond just our own family's recovery. The pattern of complaints, once fully documented and connected to the specific federal law violation, resulted in the company facing formal action that included a cease and desist regarding continuing to charge fees for initial VA disability claim assistance, along with what I understand was an ongoing broader investigation into their business practices more generally. Though I want to be honest that, as of this writing, I don't have full visibility into whatever final formal enforcement outcome that broader investigation ultimately produced. I want to end on the practical lesson here, which I think matters enormously for any veteran or veteran's family member navigating this system. Legitimate, fully free help with an initial VA disability claim exists in genuinely robust, well-established forms through veterans service organizations, county and state veteran service officers, and various accredited nonprofit veteran advocacy groups, all of whom are specifically prohibited from charging any fee for exactly this kind of initial claim assistance. Precisely because federal law has long recognized how important it is that veterans not have to choose between paying a significant chunk of a hard-won disability benefit and getting the competent help they need to actually secure that benefit in the first place. If anyone approaches a veteran or a veteran's family member offering paid help specifically with an initial disability claim, that fee structure itself, regardless of how professional or well-marketed the offer sounds, is worth treating as an immediate, serious red flag, since the entire premise of the offer depends on the veteran not knowing that the exact same quality of help, and often more experienced help given how specialized these free organizations tend to be, is available without ever needing to give up a single dollar of benefits that were always meant to be theirs in full. Story 5. I had a routine. Planned surgery at a hospital I specifically confirmed was in my insurance network, with a surgeon I confirmed was in network, at a facility I confirmed was in network, and still ended up with a $4,200 surprise bill from an anesthesiologist I never chose, never met before the day of surgery, and who turned out to be part of a staffing arrangement specifically structured to bill out of network despite operating inside an in-network facility for an in-network procedure. I want to explain the specific vulnerability this exploited, since I did everything the standard advice tells you to do before a planned procedure, and still ended up blindsided. I called my insurance company directly before scheduling, confirmed the hospital was in network, confirmed my specific surgeon was in network, and confirmed the specific procedure code was covered under my plan at the expected in-network cost-sharing rate. What I did not think to ask about, because I genuinely did not know this was a separate consideration at all, was whether every individual provider who would be involved in the procedure, specifically the anesthesiologist, who I would not select or meet until the actual day of surgery, was also independently in network. Since anesthesiology groups at many hospitals operate as separate, independently contracted entities rather than direct hospital employees, meaning a hospital's own network status does not automatically guarantee every individual specialist working within it shares that same network status. I want to describe how completely reasonable this gap felt from a patient's perspective, since at no point during the entire scheduling and pre-surgical process did anyone, not the hospital's own scheduling staff, not my surgeon's office, Not any pre-surgical paperwork I signed specifically flagged that the anesthesiologist assigned to my case might be billed separately as an out-of-network provider, despite operating inside a facility I'd specifically confirmed was in-network for a procedure I'd specifically confirmed was covered. The bill itself arrived about 6 weeks after my surgery, from a separate anesthesiology billing entity I did not recognize, charging the full, undiscounted out-of-network rate for anesthesia services during my procedure, a rate considerably higher than what my insurance would have paid, or what I would have owed had this specific provider been contracted within my plan's network, the same way my surgeon and the facility itself were. I want to describe my first reaction, which was genuine confusion, rather than immediate suspicion of anything deliberate, since I initially assumed this had to be some kind of billing error, an anesthesiologist who happened to not yet be properly credentialed with my specific insurance plan. A gap that, while frustrating, felt like it should be a fixable administrative oversight rather than a structural, ongoing arrangement. I called my insurance company first, explaining the situation and specifically asking whether there had been some kind of coding or network status error, and learned something that genuinely surprised me, which was that there are actually federal protections specifically covering exactly this situation, a relatively recent law commonly referred to as the No Surprises Act, which prohibits, with specific exceptions, exactly this kind of surprise out-of-network billing for ancillary providers, like anesthesiologists and certain other specialists, who a patient has no meaningful ability to choose or verify independently when receiving care at an in-network facility for an in-network procedure. I want to explain the specific protection this law provides, since understanding it was the entire foundation of how I resolved this. Under this federal framework, when a patient receives care at an in-network facility, for services the patient reasonably could not have separately chosen an in-network provider for, specifically including anesthesiology in most surgical contexts, the patient generally cannot be billed more than what their applicable in-network cost-sharing amount would have been, with the actual dispute over appropriate payment amount happening directly between the insurance company and the out-of-network provider through a specific, federally established negotiation and arbitration process, rather than that gap simply being passed along to the patient as a surprise bill. Armed with this specific knowledge, which I want to be honest I did not have before this happened, and had to actually research to understand clearly, I disputed the bill directly with the anesthesiology billing entity, citing the specific federal protection by name and explaining that, under this law, they were not permitted to bill me beyond my normal in-network cost-sharing amount for services rendered at an in-network facility during an in-network covered procedure, regardless of their own separate network contracting status. I want to describe the initial response, since it was not immediately cooperative, the billing entity's first reply, essentially restating their original charge and suggesting I was responsible for the full out-of-network rate, a response that, once I actually understood the law clearly, I recognized as either a genuine misunderstanding on their part regarding how the protection applies, or, more likely given how common this specific pattern apparently is according to what I later learned, an attempt to see whether I would simply pay the bill without pushing back, since a meaningful number of patients facing exactly this situation, understandably not knowing about this relatively recent legal protection, do simply pay rather than dispute. I escalated by filing a formal complaint with our state's insurance department, and separately with the federal agency that oversees enforcement of this specific billing protection, providing my original insurance verification records showing my confirmed in-network status for the hospital and my surgeon, along with the surprise bill itself and my initial dispute correspondence with the billing entity. I want to describe what happened once these formal complaints were filed, since the response shifted considerably in tone and speed once real regulatory bodies were formally involved, rather than just my own individual dispute letters. The insurance department's involvement prompted my own insurance company to directly engage with the anesthesiology billing entity regarding the appropriate payment resolution under the federal framework, a negotiation process that, notably, does not involve the patient at all once properly triggered, meaning my own specific financial exposure was capped at my normal in-network cost-sharing amount, regardless of however that underlying negotiation between the insurer and the provider ultimately resolved. That capped amount, once properly applied, came to a small fraction of the original $4,200 bill, reflecting what I would have owed had the anesthesiologist simply been in network from the beginning, a resolution that took about 10 weeks of persistent follow-up to fully finalize, but that ultimately worked exactly as the underlying federal protection was designed to function once actually invoked properly. I want to spend some time on why I think this specific type of surprise billing persists despite the federal protection existing, since understanding that helped me feel less like an isolated, unlucky case, and more like someone who'd encountered a systemic gap between what the law technically requires and what actually happens by default without a patient specifically pushing back. The protection exists, but it requires the patient to actually recognize the bill as improper and formally invoke the protection, rather than the billing entity or insurance company automatically applying it without prompting, meaning the entire system still depends heavily on individual patient awareness and persistence to actually function as intended in each specific case. A gap that, functionally, allows exactly the kind of default full-price billing I initially received to continue happening to patients who either don't know about the protection or don't have the time and energy to formally dispute it. I want to end with the practical lesson, since I think it's genuinely important for anyone scheduling any planned surgical procedure. Confirming your surgeon and facility's network status, while necessary, is not sufficient, and I would specifically encourage asking, directly, before any scheduled procedure, whether the anesthesiology group and any other ancillary specialists likely to be involved, such as a pathologist, a radiologist reviewing any imaging, or an assistant surgeon, are contracted within your specific insurance network, a question that a hospital's own billing or scheduling department should be able to answer, and if any of those ancillary providers are not in network, understanding in advance that you are, in most circumstances, still protected from surprise billing beyond your normal in-network cost-sharing amount under current federal law, a protection worth knowing about, and specifically citing by name if a bill like mine ever does arrive, despite that advance protection existing, since the law being on your side means very little in practice if you don't know to actually invoke it.